Okay, hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk. Back again with you guys for another show for the fifth instalment of our Tactical Breakdown podcast. I'm joined by the ever-present man who loves his coffee. It's Drew. How you doing, mate?
Doing okay. It's better than usual.
You don't sound sure.
I'm more awake than normal at this hour. I actually slept well for once, so I'm doing okay.
Nice, good stuff. Glad to hear. And we are very, very lucky and very honoured to be joined by. I say that to be fair, we've had Ollie on before on the show. He's been on to talk about Granit Xhaka, his favourite topic in the whole wide world, and he's going to help us out today in terms of football scouting. So, Ollie, I'm not going to insult you. So, introduce yourself, mate.
Yeah, I'm Oliver Zeziger. I'm Swiss, and I'm a football scout. I also work for Football Manager. Most of you listening to this might know the game. I'm the data chief for Switzerland, and and I'm a professional scout now for 2 years.
Brilliant stuff. So, and that's sort of the main focus of the show, and we're looking into scouting. So, I'm going to kick it off. Because whilst this is an Arsenal-related show, we do delve into sort of more broad things as well. I'm really interested in how you think sort of scouting has changed over the last, say, 10, 20 years or so. How has the whole sort of scouting situation across clubs you feel developed over the last couple of decades?
I only followed scouting maybe for 10 years, but even in that time period, scouting recruitment teams have grown bigger. And more teams have scouts now. I can remember Switzerland. Basel was among the first to really have professional scouts. They started in around 2000, and they've grown their team to up to 7 or 8 scouts at a certain point. And also it has become more data driven as well. So it's not just going to a game, watching a player, judging players, and then go home and write reports about it. It's now data driven. So someone is looking at stats and tells you, go look at that player because he has like a certain tackling stat that is outstanding, or certain speed measures that are great. So that has changed a lot. I think overall scouting has grown in importance for a club, because a scout is the eyes and the ears of a club.
I think that scouting in general has just become such a key element of trying. I mean, we look at Arsenal as sort of the example with Arsene Wenger when he came in was revolutionary, picking up these young guys from abroad. And eventually other clubs caught up and arguably even bettered Arsenal in those areas. You look at how, I'm actually really interested to see how you look at Chelsea, a club that have used scouting to a completely different level, where Chelsea sort of sign these young guys, develop them a little, and then sell them on, which kind of boosts their finances when they go for the bigger players and the sort of the substantial fees of the 50, 40s, 60 million pluses. Do you look at that type of scouting as sort of a big success in sort of the field, or actually do you look at it as something which maybe manipulates the area of scouting?
I do look at it as a type of success. I mean, Chelsea has a lot of success with their, let's say, so-called smaller transfers. Those are the guys they get for a relatively low fee, and they loan them to Arnhem or another partner club, and then sell them again for a profit. And a lot of it is good scouting. Just those players don't have and never will have the level of Chelsea, but those guys can still give financial advantages to the club. So that's an important part as well. But to be honest, that's only for a really big club like Chelsea. It could be for Arsenal as well, or another big club, but it's not for the, let's say, medium to low level tier clubs. It's impossible to do this. You only go for players who are really going to improve your first team. That's more or less what I think about it. However, I think this FIFA will ban those sort of tactics from the clubs like Chelsea in the future. They've already tried it, and if you look at when you talk bigger transfers, if you look at them now, I mean Timo Werner, Hakim Ziyech, those are great players. How they do on the pitch for Chelsea, we don't know. But on the paper, they did really well, the scouting those players and getting them for a relatively good price. I mean, you're talking the 50 million range for Timo Werner. That's okay to me. And Hakim Ziyech, I don't know the transfer fee, but it's also in a good range. So they got good players for a relatively, for a comparably lowish fee. Okay, I don't want to talk about 50 millions being low, but they got good players for good money. And now it's on the coaching stuff and the rest of the club to involve them into the tactics to make them play well at the club as well.
So, Oliver, I think you kind of brought up something that kind of frustrates some fans. I mean, you talk about Timo Werner, about the fee. Obviously, it was a release clause, but if you look at his market value, his success at RB Leipzig and the money paid, you would say that that's actually a relative bargain considering the market, what it would bear.
Yeah.
But then you have someone like Juventus paying what they paid for Arthur, who it's safe to say most Barca fans didn't think he was absolutely brilliant for them, and that you could almost say they kind of robbed the train to get the money that they got for him. So my question to you is, from a scouting standpoint, do you ever see, and I'm not quite sure how I can ask this to where you can speak about it, but do you ever see moves that go on in the market, say Arthur, for example, and you look at it and you just say, from your opinion as a scout, that he's never worth that kind of money? And is that something that, on the strength of it, how much do clubs really, in your estimation, worry about overpaying for a player? Because, I mean, there's this whole debate now about the strength of market value and if you should pay over the odds for a player just to get the deal done, or if you're paying for what that player's potential level could be, and then you draw data into that about where they may be in 2 to 3 years' time. Do you think that's more of a case-by-case kind of thing, or do you think bigger clubs are always going to maybe want to pay more just so they can get who they want, rather as a smaller club is more likely to look at market value as a definitive factor in what they might do or may not do in the market?
Big clubs will always have to pay more because just the selling club knows that the big club has money, which automatically raises the price by a certain percentage. I don't know the specifics about Arthur. I did not see him a lot. To be honest, Barcelona is not quite the level I'm scouting at. And but there are, if you know he's the right player for the system you have in place, is he's the right player for the dressing room you have in place, like in terms of character. He's still young. I think, what is it, 23-ish?
Yeah, I think so.
Around
23,
that.
24.
Yeah. So you still have, he can still improve, and you may or may not be able to sell him later again. So if all those boxes are ticked, then the price you pay in the end is not that important because you know he's the right guy. Obviously, this can always turn bad. But if that player, as I said, ticks all the boxes, if he is a good fit on the pitch, off the pitch, then go for it. Do I ever see transfers where I say that kind of player is not worth the money? Yes, and I do not comment on it publicly because it's not on me. Maybe that scout or the recruitment team who has scouted such a player has seen something that I don't. As I said, I don't watch Barcelona too often. I can't watch the Premier League too often because I'm on the road when the Premier League plays. So maybe that recruitment team has done some research on that player and found something that I don't know. So it's not on me to comment on other teams' transfers. But of course, I think sometimes that player is not worth the money. The same time as I think that a Timo Werner, for example, is a bargain deal at 50 million.
I think when you look at like the amount of the fees that are being touted around now for the young guys as well, especially, is just rising and rising and rising. Do you think it will get to a point where scouts actually start to have, this is going to sound weird, but bear with me, maybe you actually get slightly excited by this, but where scouts will begin to have their own transfer fees connected to them because the biggest scouts in the world are now being associated with the most successful clubs in the world. So do you think scouting could ever get to a stage where we start seeing scouts sort of transfer between clubs for genuine fees?
I mean, it has happened before. Sven Mislintat comes to mind. Well, he was a scout at Dortmund, then he joined you, I believe. I joined
Mhm.
Arsenal, and then now he's back at Stuttgart as sporting director. I can see this. Everybody in football who adds value to a club can be transferred for a certain fee. Usually, scouts or every member of a football club has like confidentiality clause, and this clause has to be bought. So there is usually a transfer fee involved, except if the contract runs out.
Okay, let's move the conversation more towards Arsenal then, because obviously we're an Arsenal channel mainly, and well, we are mainly. What am I even talking about? I'm an Arsenal channel. But looking specifically at some of the situations that are going on at Arsenal, you brought up Sven Mislintat there. Do alarm bells start to ring when you see Arsenal bring in the guy who is arguably the best scout in Europe in a lot of people's eyes, not on maybe on a personal level, but certainly on a professional level? And then after such a short period of time of working in this new structure with head of football Raul Sanyehi and with his links to massive super agents across Europe, that he decides to leave and, as you mentioned, go to Stuttgart. Does that signal alarm bells to you that there are issues in Arsenal's scouting network and how Arsenal might operate?
Yes and no. Yes, you obviously should be able to keep good people. Like at least I think that Sven Mislintat is very good at what he does. On the other hand, the public often knows 10% of the whole picture. And even with the media landscape in England, not everything will ever come out. So, and I know this from experience that a lot of things just are secret and stay behind the closed doors, and that's a good thing, to be honest, because some things are just not made for public, and we don't know the whole picture of the departure of Sven Mislintat. So I do, of course, there's still a certain part of me is still a fan of the whole football and of the business, and things like probably most of the listeners, things like, yeah, there must be something wrong. Then the professional side takes over and says, yeah, but we don't know the whole picture. Probably there's something that we just never know, and we'll never find out. And that's why it's tough to say yes or no about such a move.
True.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about it maybe a little bit pre-pod, and we kind of mentioned you kind of mentioned it as well when you were talking about the role of scouts and how things might be changing. But I kind of want to circle back to data again. And a lot of people, you can use Brentford as an example, where we were talking how Brentford almost exclusively buy players or target players in the market based off of data, and what they find in those scouting reports or what they observe in matches. And it's not just about maybe a player's technical ability. It's if you look at the numbers and how they fit into a certain thing, would it work for the club? So for you, as a scout, with as much as you're able to disclose, I suppose, do you really see strong validity in that kind of line of work? And do you think that's something that more and more big clubs are going to want to take a hold of maybe later on? Because again, as we said before, and you mentioned it, when a big club goes in for a player, that already jacks the price up by default. And I think Arsene Wenger mentioned that multiple times during his tenure at the club, where if you're scouting a player in the French second division and they realize that Arsenal is in for their player, they're going to want another $5 million on top of whatever price might be. Then he says you always just call it extortion. So, but if you use data to find maybe those hidden gems, kind of like what Sven Mislintat used to do, or still does, I suppose, you might be able to find those diamonds in the rough, kind of like a Matteo Guendouzi, who we might end up losing, but he fits so well at the club early on through that kind of mold. Do you think that's something that bigger clubs should do more often, or they should do it all? Or do you think it's almost kind of, in that kind of scenario, there's no point where if you can just pay the money, it doesn't really matter? What's your take?
I'm a huge fan of data scouting, and it'll grow only bigger and bigger. I do it myself, although I'm not trained to do it. I just read a lot of it on the internet. The best example of a successful player that was scouted at first based on data is N'Golo Kante. He was in the French second division, and he stood out statistically. And Leicester went from there. So he's one of the biggest success stories of the data scouting. But in the general sports world, data scouting is growing. And yeah, I do myself evaluate data statistics and everything. And then sometimes a player stands out, and that's then an interesting player to me. And I think this is an absolute must. However, it does not replace live scouting. It does not replace going to the stadium, watching a player multiple times from in home games, away games, in certain situations against the top team, against the weaker team. It does not replace this. I think I would say that in terms of importance, 70% is eye scouting, or just going to the ground and scouting a player, and 30% is data scouting, because it can point you towards a good player that you usually would not see.
When you there was a really good question in the chat box I wanted to pick up. And first of all, before I do, Laurie Nix has become a member, and thank you ever so much, Laurie, for joining up. You can become a member by clicking the join button, and you get access to exclusive content and the chance to come on the podcast next month moving forward as well. But the really good question that came in from Adam Shroud, which I hadn't really thought about at all to do with scouting, because as Drew mentioned, so much to do with data and so much looking at statistics. But how do you scout mentality and character? Because if you look at the type of players that certain managers want, it's not just about how many goals they score, how many assists they get, etc., etc. It's also about if the profile of the player's character fits into what they want. So, how much of it comes into your thinking when you're looking at certain players about their character and their mentality?
I think it's very important, and I cannot fully disclose how I do it. I think the knowledge of psychology of humans is very important to this part. What I do is, when I go to a game and I watch one specific player, watch him, I be at the game 60 minutes, maybe even more before kickoff. I watch him while warming up. I watch him how he communicates with his teammates. I watch him after the game. What does he do? Does he stay around? Does he go to the fans, or does he go straight to the dressing room? And you can do the same with training, to see if he just comes on the pitch, does his program, and then walks off, or does he do more? There is a good example from the Basel chief scout. He said in an interview that he goes to training to see how does a player treat his own boots, for example. Does he wash them himself? Does he help the assistant coaches gather balls after training? Just so little details. And that's just the one part of mentality that is not really football related. And the football related part of mentality you can see by going to different types of games. As I said, away games, home games, games where you play against a bigger team, against a lower team. Watch games where, that's probably on video, watch how he reacts when a team goes down 2-0 or 3-0. How does he react? That's all those little details paint the picture of a player. And what you can do, obviously, is to call former teammates or former coaches to ask directly, how is this player? How does he behave in training within the context of a group? And all these little details paint a bigger picture, as I said.
So, actually, I do think that's quite interesting. And usually, I think a lot of fans or maybe even players only kind of associate that level of paying attention to like the little tangibles that we'll call it when you're talking about a lot of youth players. You know, like, because I do a lot of coaching. I coach U14 to U18, and one of the things that a lot of coaches that coach in my age group would talk about here is those little things off the pitch that you see, or when you're coming up to play, a lot of good coaches will tell you like everything matters. And it's funny that you kind of alluded to that even at the professional level, every little thing matters to shape.
Of course, yes.
What you're outwardly projecting, but also what you're inwardly projecting as well. And I think that's I do like that still actually matters. At least, no, I'm sure not all scouts necessarily care, but at least to some, it is a big thing. And we had another good question from Evan Teddington, so thank you for that. He said, is there a danger that having a recruitment policy that's very similar to Dortmund or RB Leipzig, is that going to make it so that the market becomes saturated and then that all the profits never make anymore? Because they will, like Leipzig, for example, they'll always go to, say, Salzburg and grab a player for, 10 million pounds, or they'll look in France and buy someone cheap, and then they'll expand on that player, and then that player will be sold on. So they'll be making a profit. But do you worry that other clubs who they're buying players from aren't going to make that profit anymore? Do you think there's a danger of that or no?
Good question. There is a certain danger, but I think there's still enough room for other teams to adapt to the RB Leipzig or Dortmund scheme. I think it is a good policy that those two teams have in place. However, there are big clubs that are bigger clubs than those two who then still will buy a good amount for a player. I can kind of compare it to the Swiss League. The Swiss League is like a good stepping stone league for talent. I mean, Mohamed Salah is obviously the biggest example, who went through Basel and then became a superstar. And those kind of leagues are the jumping on point, I think, for young players. The same could be said about Dortmund and Leipzig, but there is a limit to it. And as you said, I think most of the Bundesliga are working this way, maybe not Bayern. Hertha is now also a buying club, not just a buying and sell on club. But most of the Bundesliga works this way. So it becomes a problem, or it could become a problem soon. Right now it isn't, but I can see a lot of teams adapting to the model of RB because it's successful. How long it will take, I don't know. I don't see it in the next 5 years. However, football, the whole business landscape has changed with Corona, so who knows how it continues. So everything changed for us as well at clubs, and we don't know how it will change further, especially in the next 5 to 6 months.
I don't know how well you'll be able to answer this question, and feel free to just bat it away if you can't. But MK said, how do agents impact on your work, and sort of how do they interact with what you do as a scout? Because I think, in my mind, I'm thinking of scouts very much as the people who are then reporting back to the club. Tell me if I'm wrong completely, as a complete novice in the area. But how do agents impact on your work a lot? Is that something you have to consider?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you like a player, then you contact his agent. That's how it is. See if there's interest. See if there's interest from a player, to get some details on the player, maybe. Do they have an impact on scouting? No. Usually not so much. I mean, the way I work is I go for, if I find a good player, then I contact the agent. Sometimes I do get contacted by agents as well, and given some profiles of players that they think are interesting, but it's quite a normal relationship. It doesn't have a big impact on me. Maybe it does have on other scouts, but when do I get in touch with them? As I said, when I find a good player and just need some information, make first contact with them, maybe. I mean, the basic question is the player ready, or is the player willing to come to the club? So that's the first question we always ask. And if it's a no, then move on. If it's a yes, then then we go from there with different questions. I also have to say, you said about scouting. That's maybe a bit of a romantic view of scouting, to still go to the stadium, or only go to the stadium and watch the games. Today there is, as Drew said, data-driven scouting. There is tactical scouting. There is a lot of different scouts out there who are trained in different areas of the game. So it's not just going to a stadium, but it's a huge part of the job, of course.
I'm as I say, I bet you get to visit loads of nice places. Go on, Drew.
I guess my sort of last question. I know people want a little bit more Arsenal specific discussion, so I guess I'll kind of take it there. It's simply, do you think that the club has done itself the right service and potentially going the route that it's lining itself up to go? You know, like we said before, with whether some of the fans agree if we should have kept Mislintat or not. You know, he was very much a proponent of a certain way of scouting a player. That is an indisputable fact. And then if you look at sort of Raul's track record when he was with Barcelona and now with us, he also is more of a fan of going through a different approach. Do you think that, in your opinion, we made the right decision? Or do you think that, whether if it was with Mislintat or not, we should have stayed with a more analytical and data-influenced way of looking at players?
I mean, you're asking me to answer questions that I cannot answer. If Arsenal made a good decision, as I said,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. We don't know all the details, so I don't know, and I don't want to comment on it. However, should Arsenal go the data-driven way? Yes, of course. That's, to me, that's a big part of the future. Other teams do it. And you mentioned Brentford. They do it very well. The Danish team who are connected to Brentford Midtjylland do it very well. Salzburg, Leipzig, very well. I think in a market where big money is thrown around, and Arsenal is, I think, among the big teams in the Premier League, is among those with less money, I think, overall.
Yeah.
So. So yeah, you can find diamonds with data scouting, and then polish them, because Arsenal has a good youth system, has a good usually makes players better, and in some cases they don't, but most cases, at least I think they do, and you can maybe save some money by going after those diamonds, like N'Golo Kante, if there are some. There could also be that the Kante is an exception. Who knows? But yeah, I totally believe that Arsenal should go the data-driven way.
Which is interesting, obviously, because I think when you look at when Arsenal bought Stat DNA, that initially was looked upon as great. We've got a manager in Arsene Wenger at the time who was well known at looking at young talent and bringing them through as being a revolutionary in that way. And then as time went on, some of the players that were brought in, and it was very well documented that like Stat DNA helped bring in someone like Mohamed El Neni as an example. Mm-hmm. And then I remember El Neni was actually the person that we ended up talking to you about. I think that was the first time when you came on the show.
I think so, yeah.
It's interesting, actually. Let me ask you on that. So, since El Neni joined, he was one of the first examples of Stat DNA being used to sign a player. Why? Because in my mind, I don't think that's worked out. That transfer just hasn't really gone the way I think that maybe El Neni thought it was going to. That maybe some of the fans, and I mean, a lot of fans just threw it to the wayside immediately by saying he was like an £8 million signing. Is that good enough for Arsenal? Probably not. And that kind of put people off using Stat DNA as sort of a barometer of talent when we were bringing in someone that didn't really succeed. Do you think it's naive to just pick on one player and go, right, El Neni didn't work out, so is it going to work out in the future? Or we've just talked about how this data-driven route has propelled certain clubs to certain levels, and it hasn't maybe worked out for Arsenal. But what have you made of the whole El Neni situation, where that's gone and where things went wrong with it?
I absolutely think it's naive to slam the data-driven way by just looking at one player. Yeah, you can say, yeah, and then it was an £8 million signing. That's cheap. It doesn't matter. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
But to slam the whole concept of data-driven scouting with the program you work with is just plain stupid, because one day it would probably give you a world beater. I don't know. Was Martinelli part of the data-driven scouting because he came from the 4th division or something like that? I remember. Was he part of the data-driven? Was he discovered by data?
No, I think it was just Edu's, because Edu was involved heavily with the Brazilian FA.
Okay.
I think he knew of him directly through his work there. I think. I don't quote me on that.
Yeah. By the way, something that's very important as a scout is to have a network.
No.
You know it, Tom, because he asks me every other week for a new contract about it.
I do.
and I'll be like, give me 5 minutes and I give you someone.
I'll send a message to Ollie and be like, give me 2 seconds.
Generally, I think the data-driven way will become even bigger, but it does not replace on-place scouting, as I said.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's really frustrating. The way I presented that question to you made me very much look like the person that was disregarding players after one, which is completely far off the mark. It's just so frustrating on social media even when he signed. I remember asking you the questions when we had you on talking about Elneny, and I was saying, like, he's only £8 million. A lot of people are writing him off already. That's not the type of signing Arsenal need. And the way that it went down meant that a lot of people just used that as a stick to beat Arsenal's stat-driven scouting with. And it's frustrating that people just write things off because of one example. And I'm so glad that you said that it is naive to sort of write things off after one comment or one example. But when you look at the players that Arsenal have started to sign, I think you can see a slight change. The Edu is a really interesting character because I haven't really seen too much of an impact from him as of yet. From what I'm aware of about the Martinelli side of things, he wasn't actually too much to do with that deal. And it was actually more Cajigal that was the main man in that setup that started to do the Martinelli stuff. Which surprised a lot of people because, we've got a Brazilian technical director. That must mean that he's involved with the Martinelli signing. Well, actually, that's quite far wide of the mark. So when we now look ahead to what Arsenal can expect to do, and you've already spoken to Drew there about stats, is there a specific part of Europe that you think is currently untouched that could be somewhere that Arsenal need to look at as a final way to sort of bookend this conversation? Without giving away any trade secrets, obviously.
Yeah, of course. I think there is a general problem behind it. That problem may also apply to Mohamed Elneny. It is very hard to judge the differences in leagues. The play level, the tactical level, the physical level needed, and that's why it's hard to answer that question with just one answer. Are there? Yeah, there are some leagues that stand out to me, but are they really for Arsenal to invest more in terms of scouting? I don't know, because that's one of the hardest parts. That's always the question that comes up. Hey, how do you judge the league level and compare the league level on, as I said, mental, physical, tactical aspects, and how can you then say, yeah, a player like Elneny would be a success in the Premier League? That's one of the toughest part of the jobs. And to your question, I still think that there are a lot of good players in Spain. I talk specifically Arsenal. I think there are a lot of good players in Spain. It's not an untapped market at all, but I think it's not yet dried up. Portugal as well. Arsenal did not have a lot of Portuguese players, didn't they?
Cedric came in, but I mean that.
Cedric, okay,
for a while. But I can't think of Portuguese players.
Luis Boa-Morte was Portuguese.
Yeah,
that's one, but that's a throwback though. That's
like 15 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but I'm trying to think of even Portuguese clubs that we've signed players from that.
Yeah, the French league. Yeah, obviously the French league, but Arsenal is like they're very active on the French league. But I think Portugal is a market that Arsenal could look into it.
Not Danilo Pereira then. I might cry if we signed Danilo Pereira. There was an interesting comment from Ariane who thrown in a super chat, so I'm going to read it out. He said, I think LFC's model is a good way of going about it, using data analysis with a certain model to go off of it. Edwards' data analysis and Klopp's coaching is why they are where they are. And I mean, another thing that came up was the talking about Premier League talent is that Arsenal aren't really buying from the Premier League, and you just mentioned there about how difficult it is that while you can have the best scouting system in the world, and you might identify a brilliant player playing in the environment that they're currently in, but when that transitions across to England, things can go very wrong very quickly, and I think that's maybe what we saw from Mohamed El Neni. And some other examples as well. So I think that was a really, really important. We're going to finish off with a question that Drew pointed out for me from Jeremiah that said, what position is stats least effective for scouting? I think it's centre-back. Look at Mustafi. He has amazing stats, but moments of lapses. Another good question, as Drew points out.
Yeah.
So what position, I suppose, is do you find most challenging to scout?
Centre backs, true. I think also defensive midfielders are difficult to scout because you don't see them often in games. When you see them, they make a good tackle or a great long ball, great build-up play, but you don't see them often. And those who you don't see often are usually the good ones. And I'm not talking about the Andrea Pirlos, obviously, because you noticed them from the start, but like those physical presences or those really good players. I think the tough part is or at least I cannot judge a defensive midfielder by just one game. I need to see him over a series of games to decide if he's good or not, because consistency is one of the biggest, greatest attributes for a football player in general, but especially for a defensive mid. And if he does well over the 4 games, then I'm pretty sure that's a good player. Centre backs, the problem is if a centre back does a mistake, there is a good probability that it's a goal, that it ends up being a goal. So that's obviously drags down then the perception of a centre back. Does not necessarily mean that that's a bad centre back, just that he has maybe flaws in concentration or in his positioning or wherever. If it's a young centre back, don't worry about it; he will improve. But if it's the kind of Mustafi, and I saw some of his games, then probably he's not made for that kind of level. Obviously, easiest to scout is wingers or strikers. Those who have the ball a lot are quite easy to scout, and I mean easy, yeah. If you have an eye for it, obviously, it's totally easy. Yeah.
Awesome. I've learned a hell of a lot, it's fair to say. Drew hasn't, because he knows everything about football already, which I'm sure is how he sees things. But we really appreciate your time, Ollie, coming on the show. Can you tell people where they can find you? Not personally, just on social media.
You can visit me in Biel in Switzerland. Twitter is at AULIT_Z or Oliver Zesiger, and that's pretty much the only social media I use regularly. So
brilliant, awesome. Right, we will catch up with you very soon, Ollie. Oh, I'll send you a text in about 5 minutes asking about another player, I'm sure. So
sure, you can have that contact for the second Icelandic division, no problem.
What I'm after. It's been a real pleasure speaking, Ollie. Speak to you later.
Thanks Ollie.
For having me.
Good to talk to you, buddy.
No worries. Drew, that was so informative, it's fair to say. And once again, in terms of like the comment box as well, some of the questions being thrown in by the guys who are watching is just so clear and informative for us to be able to ask these questions too. Yeah. What I think there's a big sort of focus in, and next week's show especially is going to be looking into Red Bull Salzburg as an example of a club that develops young by scouting some really high quality young players and then developing and selling them on. And that's something that we've talked about on the show being key to how Arsenal need to improve, is that they need to identify players at a young age and then be able to have sell-on value, not looking at 27, 28, 29-year-olds that you bring in, sign them on to 250, 300 grand a week, and at the end of their contract, you're either panicking because you're not going to re-sign them for another 2-3 years, or you're going to leave them for 10 million, 20 million quid, nowhere near what their market value was when you bought them. So when you look, and now what we've learned about scouting, does it make you more concerned about Arsenal's situation, or do you actually think there's an element of hope?
I mean, I'm always going to lean toward well, that, yeah, but I'm always going to lean towards kind of trying to find players for lower fees and making them better. And if you do have to lose them, then you financially benefit the club. I'm always a big fan of that. I just think, when you have kind of the setup that we have, and we have shown that we, as Oliver said from his perspective as well, that we do have a youth system that does improve players. So I'm not advocating that we become a Chelsea and bring in 40 young players and then, the best 6 make it and the other 34 we just check out for fees. But we've shown that we can progress them. I think you're seeing now with a couple of the younger players we've had come through the system where they're increasingly getting minutes in the first team. Some of them had successful loan spells. They have some eyes from other clubs. The ones we have to lose. But I'd rather do that. And same thing with the first team. Sometimes, it's difficult because I think a lot of the fans want to get us back challenging for a top 4 and for silverware immediately, right? Like tomorrow, which is why I think a lot of them are very supportive of the idea of going out and getting someone like Thomas Partey, whereas they like the idea of getting like a Dominic Szoboszlai. But I think that in that situation, it's more of a lot of the fans that are kind of chiming for that deal kind of see the 3 to 5 year picture, whereas they don't realistically think he's going to be the one to push us on back to Champions League the following season. That's what they view Partey as. But if we're not going to be able to really compete in the market for someone like a Timo Werner that Chelsea got, or someone like that, then you have to go the other route. There's no point in beating your head against the wall if you're not going to be able to get through it. And I think just for us, for right now, until we get to a position where we can compete, we've got to go a route that's been proven. And I know there's a lot of talk about, can it work in the Premier League? There's so much money in the Premier League. It's so easier for teams around you to spend above their means to really put you in a corner. And I think we've seen that recently with Leicester, Everton, and Wolves. Wolves will spend as much money as we have in the last 2 transfer windows, but they've brought in, I think it's 13 players, and they just got promoted 2 seasons ago. So, and they're already throwing out a wad of cash, and they're doing it in a way where they're not going after 50, 60 million pound players. They're going after multiple 20 million pound players, 25 million pound players, and it's drastically improved their first team in rapid order. And then off the back of having Nuno as a manager, they look like they're kind of almost using that LFC model that Arjen alluded to, where you're bringing in good players but with a really good manager, and they're fitting the system, and it doesn't take long for it to mesh. So, and the other thing, unfortunately, I know someone brought it up in the chat before, but I don't think Arsenal can really afford to compete in the English market, and we're not the only big club that doesn't buy English. That's the thing, and I think it's. People think in isolation it's just us, but I literally did this last week. I drew up the table of us and our 7 closest domestic rivals in terms of spending. City have only bought in 2 players from Premier League teams in the last 3 seasons. Tottenham have only bought in 1. We've bought 1. Wolves have bought 0 if you don't include Benicofobia, because he's not really Premier League proven. He had it all to prove. It's
what
like
I would say though, to sort of like caveat that before you go on, is that if you look at what Man City have done, is that they invested early in Premier League players. You look at Sterling, you look at Mahrez, you look at those types of players, and then they've built around those with other players from outside. So that's where I think it differs.
I think it depends. I think it's a case-by-case basis because, well, I'm talking about the last 3 years specifically. I'm not talking about like whenever they bought Sterling, for example. So, they bought Mahrez 2 seasons ago, and he's still really not. He's playing more, but is he really nailed on for a choice for the club? No, not really. But that's not what City are after. City are after players who give them strength and depth because they're trying to fight on multiple fronts. So that's why they brought in someone like Mahrez, even though he wasn't going to be guaranteed every week. They can rotate and not worry about a drop in quality. But there's so many other teams that just aren't, and Oliver had mentioned it, and people in chat mentioned it. If you're an Arsenal and you go to, I don't know, Bournemouth and say, talk to me about Nathan Ake, if Everton's doing it, it's 30 million. If we're doing it, it's 45 million. And when you're so, you kind of have the gun to your temple financially about that, it's just because with your name comes more financial expectation in return. it's tough to compete with that, and that's why.
Yeah.
And you kind of almost see the same thing in other leagues as well. People will definitely, hold Dortmund to ransom if they're after a player a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time it'll happen. So they'll look elsewhere. And I think it's funny that Ali mentioned it, that RBL has off the bat automatically started to go outside. But obviously they have their link with Salzburg through Red Bull, so that's automatically easy. But they go to France. Look how many players they brought in from France for pennies of what they probably should be going for. And
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. So if you know where you can definitely corner a market and where your financial strength actually means something there, rather than it's being used against you, you should be going that route. And that's something that we should absolutely be looking into. But that's just my take. So.
No, that's fair enough. We're going to wrap things up. I know that there's a lot of shouts in the chat box talking about Balogun, which we will discuss, and you won't have to wait too long to talk about that, because a little bit later on this evening, as it is the day after the game, we are doing the usual TGT podcast with Drew. Will be back, so he'll be able to express his severe discontent around that situation a little bit later on tonight. So make sure that you turn those notifications on, because we'll be live around 8:30 p.m. tonight UK time. To discuss about Balogun in the normal podcast, as well as more from the Sheffield United game and a little bit more about what's to come. So if you've enjoyed the show, please make sure you drop a like on the video. Make sure you subscribe to us and follow us on Twitter at The Gooner Talk TV. You follow Drew at FM Lera, and make sure you give Ollie a follow as well at Ollie_Z, which you can find on Twitter as well. I'll leave that all in the description as well, so you have no trouble finding it. It's been a real pleasure talking to you as always. We'll see you again very, very soon. And as always, up the Arsenal.
Good show.